president and CEO of Eastern State Penitentiary Historic Site. We are a nonprofit organization based here in Philadelphia, and we are dedicated to increasing awareness, education, and understanding of the criminal justice reform movement. Here at what we lovingly refer to as ESP, we interpret the legacy of the American criminal justice reform movement over time. This series that we're a part of tonight is Justice 101. It's a new series for this organization, and it dives into that history of the justice system in America from its founding to today. And we really look closely at the impact that it has on our society, our citizens, and our world. As we dive into these amazing topics, we have also been very grateful to have amazing speakers that we're going to have tonight, so we can all ask questions and learn from them and their experiences. One thing before we dive into this panel, before we go into it, our next Justice 101 will be on May 13th at 1 p.m. on Zoom, and it's on policing in America. We'll be navigating the Fourth Amendment, looking closely at policies like stop and frisk, and exploring civil rights around policing in America. So check us out and find out more at easternstate.org. Now, tonight's topic is the 13th Amendment, diving deep into looking at exploring the 13th Amendment and the persistence of forced labor in prisons in America. And when we think about it, it's 157 years ago that the 13th Amendment abolished slavery. Yet hundreds of thousands of people are still living in some way in legally mandated enslavement, involuntary servitude, due to the loophole in the 13th Amendment. This can allow states to extract free labor from prisons. Now we have 65% of incarcerated people reporting being forced to work within a prison. And what we're going to dive in tonight is, how does this happen? Where is the legal conversation around this, both historically and today? And what are some of the reforms that are being presented to address it? The 13th Amendment was established in 1865. It was ratified in 1865 and added to the United States Constitution at the end of the Civil War. And its goal was to abolish slavery in the United States. But many often talk about the loophole of the 13th Amendment. So let's pause for a minute, and because I love the Constitution and will forever want to talk about it, let's really read the 13th Amendment and what the words say directly. Section 1 of the 13th Amendment says, "Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime, whereof the party shall be duly convicted, shall exist within the United States, or any place subject to their jurisdiction." Section 2, which I hope we get to tonight, just at least for a little bit, says Congress shall have power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. This was passed by Congress in January 31st, 1865, and ratified December 6th, 1865. Today, we're going to delve into this complex issue around the 13th Amendment. And we have brought together this amazing panel. Let me introduce them to you now. But first, before I do that, I want to thank all of you for joining us. This is a very broad mix of experts on this panel, and we feel very excited for your sharing your knowledge, your experience, and helping us all learn about this. So thank you all. Now, let's dive into our bios. I'll try to do this quickly because I really want you all to introduce yourself and your experience with this topic. Alexander, or Alex Tsesis, is the Demoted Chair of Constitutional Law at Florida State University College of Law. He is also the General Editor of the Cambridge Studies on Civil Rights and Civil Liberties at the Oxford Theological Foundation in Law. Tsesis scholarship and teaching focuses on the breadth of subjects, including constitutional law, civil rights, constitutional reconstruction, interpretive methodology, free speech theory, and legal history. Welcome, Alex. We also have Jennifer Turner. Jennifer Turner is a human rights researcher in the ACLU's Human Rights Program. She conducts documentation, research, and advocacy on human rights violations in the United States, with a focus on criminal justice, policing, national security, radical justice, women's rights, children's rights, and immigrant rights. She is the author of numerous ACLU reports, including one we're going to talk about tonight, Captive Labor. We will share everybody's bios and their readings during the wrap up at the end of the program, because there are many more options to dive deeper into our panelists. Our next panelist is Wilfredo Laracuente. He is an advocate, an educator, and a formerly incarcerated leader working with detainees on transition skills on Rikers Island. He aims to provide a voice for incarcerated people by not only providing insight into the struggles that incarcerated people face daily, but actively working towards the deconstruction of the harmful and dehumanizing nature of prisons. Most recently, Wilfredo was a community organizer with the Office of the Community Liaison. We will also have, if he's not here already, Councilman O'Rourke join us from Philadelphia. The Honorable Reverend Nicolas O'Rourke is a Philadelphia City Council minority whip. He's a pastor of the Living Waters United Church of Christ in Oxford Circle and the second Working Families Party member elected to the Philadelphia City Council. Working at the intersection of faith and justice, he served as the Faith Leaders Caucus for Co-Chair for Power. In the capacity, he has focused on dismantling the crippling effects of mass incarceration and police brutality on people of color, advocating for fully funded schools, championing better pay, as well as combating other issues that we see around the country, our city, and the globe as well. So thank you all so much for being here. Councilman O'Rourke, perfect timing on that intro. Welcome to you as well. Now let's dive into this. I'm actually going to start you all with a foundational question. Each one of you comes at this topic in a very different way, with very different experience and expertise. So I'd love for you all to take a beat on how you come to this topic of looking at the 13th Amendment and forced labor in prisons, and really help our audience understand your research, your scholarship, your work, and how we're going to talk about tonight's conversation. So as a good historian, I'm going to do this as a timeline because there's nothing I like more than a timeline. And Professor Tsesis, I'd like to start with you, Alex.
Well, I'm a student of civil rights and have been since I was very young, since I was in day school, since elementary school. And it's an area you mentioned my series. I have the correct titles: Cambridge Studies on Civil Rights and Civil Liberties. And I have one on Oxford Theoretical Perspectives of Law. But I find it critical to understand American history in order to better serve causes of justice and aspirational visions in the Constitution of the Declaration of Independence.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Jennifer Turner, would you like to go next?
Yes. So I'm a human rights researcher. I look at and document human rights violations in the U.S. across a range of issues. But the seeds of the research on incarcerated workers came from work. I was doing work on life without parole sentences for nonviolent offenses. And I was at Angola Prison in Louisiana, which is situated on the site of former slave plantations. And while I was there to talk to the warden of the prison and to people who are incarcerated for life, I witnessed the prison labor programs there, and driving through the fields and seeing incarcerated workers, almost entirely whom were Black men, laboring in the fields with hoes while overseen by correctional officers on horseback, armed with shotguns, was a vision of slavery. And it stayed in my mind of something, and I want to look at prison labor programs. I also, as interested in workers' rights, interested in the rights and conditions of work of nearly 1 million workers in our country who are incarcerated in our prisons. And so this also, to me, was a workers' rights issue. And there was so little information available publicly, very few studies of how many people are working in prisons, what are they paid, what kind of work are they doing? And that led to this really large undertaking of trying to document the conditions of work, types of work, and just broadly looking at prison work programs in every state in the country.
Amazing. Thank you for sharing that. Wilfredo, would you like to share kind of your perspective and how you come at this discussion of the 13th Amendment and forced labor in prisons?
Well, for me, I come from the perspective of personal experience. As a former incarcerated leader, I had worked in Coilcraft Industries for over 10 years. So I remember starting at the bottom, making a whopping 15 cents an hour for cold craft industries, and I was able to bump it up to probably about 45 cents an hour. So from my perspective, is a little different and unique is that I come from the perspective that the public needs to know that there are government institutions and institutions of higher learning that are still receiving discounted goods at the blood, sweat, and tears of the Black and brown individuals that have to deal with these particular atrocities behind the wall of prison. So I come from this perspective because, people do tongue in cheek and government officials and judges actually sit on the chairs and sentence Black and brown individuals from the 5 boroughs on the very chairs that we make for pennies on a dollar. And Coldcraft is an approved vendor that is mandated by New York State in order to be utilized for a certain percentage of the items they have to purchase. So I come from that particular perspective and just the personal experience of what goes on. And even, the state has the nerve to want to have discounted customer service from the Department of Motor Vehicles when they want to go ahead and have someone clear up an issue with their driver's license. They're talking to a woman that is housed at Albion or Bedford Correctional Facility. So even customer service, the state wants to have at a discounted price at the hands of the women that are incarcerated for a whopping 45 cents an hour.
Thank you so much. And Councilman O'Rourke, we'd love to hear kind of your focus in this area.
Yeah, thank you. I probably frame it by 3 different kind of angles by which I approach the work. One is being a part of a family with a brother who was incarcerated, did 10 years in the disciplinary barracks, and the amount of money that we had to put on the books to make sure that he was able to have what he needed while he was incarcerated. And so having that personal relationship and experiencing the impact thereof is something that definitely shapes and kind of forms me. I also, while that may be the case, I also come to this work as a minister. I pastor a small church in Northeast Philadelphia, and so I have a moral concern about the ways by which those who are perceived as the fringes of society, those, as we say in my tradition, that are the least, the lost, the left out, how they are seen as, which is the case for racial capitalism, kind of a place for extraction of wealth and labor. And so that's an issue for me always in terms of how human beings are being exploited. But not only do I have a ministerial call and concern, not only is my family personally impacted, but now as an elected official, I have not just a concern and an impact, but a charge to see to it that I am looking out for the public will. And I do think that it's important to know that in City of Philadelphia, even right down here in City Hall, where I'm at right now, much of the furniture that's utilized by municipal workers in the city is made through prison labor. And so it's interesting how little is paid. And we just asked some questions about this recently in budget hearings. And so I say all that to say that through my calling, my life calling as a minister of the church, as my electoral calling as a minister of the state, and as one who has personal experience through my brother, I find this to be challenging and really a call to improve how we're living and how we're doing this at all.
Thank you. And as I was diving into this panel and looking at everybody's bios and all this frame of research, I don't typically want to ask these general softball questions, but I thought it was such a powerful collection of people on this panel tonight that I think for our audience to see how each of you is putting a piece of this puzzle together for us as an audience to understand it and to frame it around the lens that we come at it. So Alex, you really phrased that so perfectly, that you come at this topic of civil rights and civil liberties through the historical reference, and that gives you your framing and your understanding. And that is exactly what I wanted you to ask, to tee us up and give us a little bit of understanding of what is the 13th Amendment. We read it earlier. I read it earlier. We know it was 1865. But what are the words? Where do they come from? How did they come up with these words? And then soon after the 13th Amendment was added to the Constitution, what was its impact in the 1860s, late 1860s, 1880s? And I did hear you also mention that you do also not only look at the Constitution, but the Declaration. So if there's any insight that we can layer into this conversation around the Declaration, I would like you to feel free to bring in another document of historic reference. I will be all in.
So you've asked me a lot of questions, and I will try not to be too long on this because I want to hear from the other panelists. The Declaration was the aspirational aspect that gave life and meaning for the advocacy of the abolitionist movement. And the abolitionist movement really had, it was very widely impactful in the United States up through around the 1820s, early 1830s. And then so slavery was viewed as an evil that needed to be ended. And the Declaration was often taken, even in 1776, there are people talking about the contradiction of slavery and the Declaration. Andrew Benezet, for example, a very famous Quaker minister, talked about it in 76 and 1776, 1777, and there were others. There was a rebirth of the abolitionist movement, but they were really they were attacked, often violently attacked, even in Boston. William Lloyd Garrison, and there were other groups. Frederick Douglass, of course, and another group of abolitionists was extremely important, but they had very little influence up until the Civil War, and people realized the evil that had come about not only through slavery itself, but also in the Supreme Court decision of Dred Scott, and saying that blacks had absolutely no role and no place in the Declaration, which was completely contrary to the way that the founders saw it. Even slaveholders, that they were hypocrites who maintained slavery. But I want to jump to the Declaration, to the 13th Amendment. I'm trying to do this in a nutshell as fast as I can. So the wording of the 13th Amendment came somewhat by happenstance when it was proposed in 1864 by James Ashley of Ohio, and then by someone else in the Senate. But the words came from Thomas Jefferson in the first proposal of the Northwest Ordinance in 1784. And therein come the really problematic wording that Jennifer and Wilfredo and Nicolas have alluded to. It was Jefferson who proposed that while there would be no slavery in what was the Northwest Territory, which was an absolutely huge territory that included Illinois, Wisconsin, Indiana, Michigan, there would be no slavery. But Jefferson proposed that there would be this exception for slavery, for criminals. And this came actually from the fact that many of the Arabs who sold slaves to the whites, who then would transport them to the New World, were enslaving people because of what they said were crimes or during times of war. So Jefferson brought that in, and in the final draft of the Northwest Ordinance, the language that influenced the 13th Amendment was included, that included this exception for crimes, that slavery would not be permitted in the territories, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except for punishment for crimes. When the exact language we have in the 13th Amendment was adopted by the Senate, United States Senate Judiciary Committee, with Lyman Trumbull being the chair, and he adopted this language from the Northwest Ordinance. It's not precisely the same language that you read in the 13th Amendment, but very close, with the same exception, and neither slavery nor involuntary servitude in Section 1 of the 13th Amendment. Section 2 is the enforcement clause that gives Congress power. And it was a committee that was not reported back then in the 1860s. The Senate debates were reported, but the committee debates were not. So we don't really know why they chose this provision. We really aren't even sure why Jefferson had thought of it in 1784, and then it was included in 1787 in the Northwest Ordinance. But then it came about. And then the very final thing, and I apologize, I'm really trying to be brief here, is that it had a huge impact in the 1860s. So immediately following abolition, there was an attempt to re-enslave blacks under a different name called the Black Codes, which barred them from property ownership, sometimes specifically, often in collusion with past slaveholders who were trying to keep people under bondage without saying that it was bondage, under contracts and so on. And it was because of the power that the 13th Amendment gave Congress under Section 2 that Congress was able to pass the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which is still good law. It prohibits discrimination in property ownership. in selection, in court proceedings, in contracts and so on. And because of that power, Congress was able to break the black codes and end them. So that's its power in the 1860s and its source.
That's really helpful because you probably read my mind about where towards the end of this conversation, I'm going to come back and ask you about the legal powers that we have in some of these, the second founding era and how we can leverage those second founding era powers. That was unbelievably helpful. And thank you. That was 3 major documents really quickly. And you just gave us a really strong foundation in understanding that. Now, Jennifer, I'm going to turn it over to you next because in this essence of the timeline that we follow, we really quickly see the Supreme Court, embrace this idea that people who are incarcerated do not have rights. And there's a case in 1871, I'll drop it in the chat in a minute, where the Supreme Court says let me read it exactly, that he is for a time being the slave of the state. Now, we know this case was overturned by multiple other cases by 1948 that started to really spell out that there are some rights and privileges that people who are incarcerated still hold, even if they are limited, that they still hold. And then subsequent cases that spell out due process and equal protection clauses. But in your work and your research around captive labor, exploitation of incarcerated workers that you published in 2022, you really talk about and I'll quote you, the reality is that once people enter the prison gates, they lose the right to refuse to work. So can you kind of help us understand where we see this defining of liberty and rights in the founding, this reaffirmation of the Declaration's voice and power in trying to right the wrongs and trying to experiment in an interracial democracy, but very quickly the reincarceration of primarily African-American people and used to reestablish no rights when labor is connected while incarcerated?
Yeah, as Alex said, the passage of the Black Codes allowed the effective reincarceration of Black men throughout the South, and the exception clause in the 13th Amendment is mirrored in state constitutions throughout the country. Now, 16 state constitutions still contain this language. Some state constitutions, such as New York's, don't have an all-out prohibition on forced labor because it predates the 13th Amendment, and courts have interpreted this to mean that there really isn't protection against forced labor for incarcerated workers. Incarcerated workers are also excluded from all other standard workplace protections, and this is a direct consequence of slavery. The same way that farm workers are excluded from basic labor laws, so too are incarcerated people. Incarcerated people are excluded from minimum wage laws, the right to unionize and collectively bargain for improved work conditions, the right to be free from discrimination in the workplace. They're also excluded from federal and most state workplace safety laws and protections. And what this means is that the federal prison system and most state prison systems have compulsory prison labor systems that require people to work. You do not have the option to opt out. You have to work the job that you are assigned. You have no say about the work assignment. You are subject to the whims of prison officials who will assign you jobs. And even if you're unwilling or unable, if you're infirm, sick, disabled, elderly, unable to opt out of that work, and you can be punished. You are threatened with punishment, and these punishments are imposed. And these punishments are severe: solitary confinement, denial of visitation, the ability to call home, denial of access to commissary for access to necessities like warm clothing, sufficient food, medications, being downgraded into more restrictive and terrible housing units, and also having impact on your parole eligibility. If you refuse to work or unable to work or unable to perform your job sufficiently, work too slow when you're working the farm line at Angola Prison, for instance, you can be punished with a denial of good time credits, which effectively extends your prison sentence. You get write-ups that impact your parole eligibility. And all of this means that people have to perform the job regardless of what the impact is on them. And I can go on, but I don't want to extend to talk on too long. But if you'd like me to speak more about it, I can.
This is wonderful, and you all are perfectly layering these conversations and these understandings. How do we get from here to there? Wilfredo, this is where you've spoken on this topic so many times in the past. I was talking to Wilfredo before we started, and I recognize his name because I've watched so many times that he's spoken on this topic. And it's a powerful story that you talk about really understanding about the practice of using the 13th Amendment to systemize and systematically force labor within the entire prison system. So looking at this from the founding of the Constitution to the fall of Reconstruction, the loophole of forced labor in the 13th Amendment, every time you spoke on this, I kept thinking you're talking about how do we get from slavery to the forced labor of today. And this practice, which some refer to as slavery by another name, has gone unchecked. Those are your words. They've gone unchecked. And it's embedded into our justice system, into our carceral system. Can you speak a little bit more on that connection and how you have seen this legacy come about today? And even some suggestions, and I know I'm a great 3-question questioner, on ways that we can curb this and contain it to a way that it's more appropriate for our justice system as a fair and just society.
Okay, so unpack it going backwards, I don't think you can go ahead and chain it. I think when it comes to the bottom dollar and government institutions need money in order to run their daily operations, it will never be chained. A lot of people talk about abolitionists or eradicating. You will not eradicate this particular system. The system needs to be trimmed and it needs to be curtailed and it kind of needs to be wrangled in. But the thing is they're not the only institution that is utilizing this this particular forced slave labor as we're talking about, because chattel slavery exists right now today in 2024. Right now, there are people that are working, and I'll even go far as the pandemic. We were making hand sanitizer inside Great Meadow Correctional Facility. There were coffins being made at Green Haven Correctional Facility with no masks, with the unknown of not knowing what this disease was. Everybody was confined to their cells, except for the majority of the people that were told that they have to come out and be mandated to have this particular work. And I push back a little bit on the forced labor portion of everybody understands in New York prisons, if you don't work, you will be in solitary confinement and you will understand. There are men that make those choices and women as well. So my thing is that each individual has their own choice of whether they're going to come out their cell to work. So I just wanted to say that. But for me, it's just that when you have SUNY and CUNY schools that are using desks, when you have the district attorney's office that has soap dispensers that are made from Great Meadow Correctional Facility, and that pink soap that is utilized in these particular small plastic spigots that are then put inside these particular things, and they have the nerve to have Coalcraft put on those tags. This is an approved vendor that is in concert with the Department of Corrections. And what they do at certain facilities is they go ahead and they make goods. And these particular goods are just created, they're made, they're put into regular catalogs, and they're sold to other government institutions like the Department of Education, to the SUNY and CUNY schools, and then they're told, because they receive federal aid from the government, that they have to utilize this particular vendor. So, I mean, even the Department of Motor Vehicles, if everybody has a license plate, that metal is put on a large circular metal sheet that's put in a truck that's sent to Attica. Then from Attica, it's sent to Auburn Correctional Facility, where it's pressed into the rectangular plates. They're sheened, they're stained, the numbers are placed on them, they're put in boxes, and they're cataloged and shipped in another truck going to the Department of Motor Vehicles for use by motorists. Stop signs, yield signs, highway signs, all these particular things are made. And to be honest with you, we run prisons. The average ordinary daily operations that happens in all correctional facilities are by us for pennies on the dollar. We do all the electrical work. We do all the floor buffing. We do all the cooking that comes from Quick Chill, that has come from Utica, New York. We're the ones that make the majority of the meals. We're the ones that make sure that the correctional officers are able to go ahead and sit by with their cushy heinies and make sure that all they have to do is turn keys, and we're the ones that do the heavy lifting. So then I ask, if we're doing the heavy lifting, and in New York there is this loophole, even a place like Alabama, already has closed that loophole. So here we are going to say logically that Alabama is more progressive than New York. I mean, I highly doubt it. But the thing is that, and I think Mr. O'Rourke can allude to it when it comes to government and it comes to budgets and it comes to big business, that you have places where you have to go ahead and generate revenue in order to make sure that an enormous machine like a city or a state needs to run, that it has to find other places to find this flow. And New York has just found a cash cow that comes from coal craft industries. And that thing is, even the children in the Department of Education that sit on these particular desks, those are all made by people from Black and brown communities, Black and brown prisons, the majority of people there from Comstock Correctional Facility. So, I mean, with all this money being generated for pennies on a dollar, I mean, someone could pull out a $20 bill and that'll probably pay a full-man crew to make about 350 chairs per week at about 15 cents an hour. So why would Coalcraft ever have to worry about anything happening? Because if nothing affects the bottom dollar, they're going to continue to do it. And it's a system that's in place and it's just part of the course. But now the conversation is changing. Now everybody is on top of mass incarceration. Everybody wants to interject humanity. By all no means am I going to say anyone inside corrections needs to receive minimum wage. I'm not going to say that, because I feel there needs to be some form of accountability, and prison is supposed to be uncomfortable. The carceral state is there for a reason, because you have done something, regardless of any government institution, that has failed you prior to disenfranchisement, arrested development. We can go into a whole plethora of things that have happened with the disenfranchised. But when you speak to now coming home and then not providing services for the reentry process, now that's where the mortar gets a little muddy, because the data is clear. We all are going to return. We all are going to be returned citizens. But in what manner are we returned home, and how broken we are is going to be a system that's generating millions and billions of dollars for years. What are the reparations that look like to be able to have for the incarcerated individuals that have gone ahead and made all these goods at pennies on the dollar, which if we were in the street, we will all have a decent wage, we'd have insurance, we'd have protections. So where does it say that this is true public safety? Isn't it public safety to make sure everyone comes out able to go ahead and be productive and not have to be placed or leaned on another government institution upon their release? So sometimes you have to be able to understand that the system has been in place for a reason, and that's because it's a cash cow that makes sure a lot of states and a lot of cities are able to function fully on a municipal dollar.
Thank you so much. That you really just pulled out kind of the essence of, if we look at this system's impact, what are the possibilities of changing it, and what are the barriers around that too? Because we have to be direct and honest about that too. Because if you're going up and thinking something is like barrier that the public can do this and that will change, you're going to lose in that battle, or it's just going to shift to a different view. You also bring up this key question that we talk about on this site every single day here is, what is the purpose of a prison? What is the purpose? What is the outcome? When they consider that, very quickly after the Declaration and the Constitution in Philadelphia, looking at, if we are going to remove somebody's liberty, that we just told the world that we believe in liberty, we believe in citizenship. We all know not for everybody at that time, but they were still making those statements. They were still looking at, how are we removing liberties from people, and what is the purpose of prison? And they grappled with that here, and that's how Eastern State was formulated. This perfectly pulls to Councilman O'Rourke. You're my Philadelphian, so I can ask you this question directly. As we think about this, and we think about what is the purpose, Eastern State, with the Quaker belief, was to give people a skill, give people a fresh start. So when they came out of Eastern State, they had a skill that they could use. So you did not have recidivism, that you had an ability to make money and were equipped about that. What are some of the work that you're doing in Philadelphia and seen across this state around this question around forced prison labor that is not adequately supervised? It's definitely not unionized. It's may not be even paid, but also about coming back and fresh starts and re-entry programs and the support that is needed to be an active member of our society and an active citizen, that you never lose your citizenship. So would you like to kind of dive into that very unique case study of Philadelphia?
Sure. Yeah. Well, thank you for asking the question. The first priority as it regards Philly's prisons has to be addressing the serious constitutional violations that occur too often within the facilities themselves. Following a 2020 lawsuit, Philly's prisons had been federally monitored due to the severe neglect that folks on the inside face every day. That was, mind you, I think that was even before the oncoming of the COVID pandemic, and then all that we have seen and heard, as Wilfredo already lifted up, that came out of that time. It's gotten so bad that the federal monitor has actually insisted that some element of decarceration, letting people actually leave the prisons, is necessary for the department to resume even normal operations. So Philly has to step its decarceration game up significantly, especially considering how Philadelphia, in many ways, not unlike some other more progressive cities, really is kind of a ground zero for decarceration work. When you look at how that is kind of coming up from various organizations and just community groups, a lot of that is finding an epicenter here, because I think that Philadelphia was one of the more incarcerated cities at one point in recent memory. And obviously that impacts prison labor. But as it relates to prison labor directly, I should say, I feel like there are two main points of emphasis, which are raising wages and shifting revenue streams. It'll be a long, very arduous, challenging lift, but I take solace in what Dr. King said. The moral arc is long, really, really, really long sometimes, but it does bend toward justice. So we're going to keep at that work. And our office is interested in figuring out how to raise wages at Philacor, which will be a point of a focus for us in the upcoming months, and certainly throughout the. We've already kind of broached this topic, as Philadelphia City Council is already in the midst of budget negotiations and budget hearings right now. Lastly, Philacor was last audited by the city in 2015 in an investigation that was looking into the organization's financial controls. And given what we know about prisons in the wake of the lawsuit, it might be time for us to take another look at Philacor. Because as I mentioned to you at the very beginning, what I found out coming into this particular building was that the majority of the furniture that is made through prison labor. And, as others have already mentioned, and even I think I've seen in the comments here, the logic being this is the system that's set up. This is a cheap way to extract labor and get certain things done. So that's there. I operate, as I told you before, I'm a minister. So I come from a prophetic, what we call the Black prophetic tradition. And one of the things that King lifted up in 67, 68, before they killed him, was this point, which all labor has dignity. All labor has dignity. Every person behind those bars is a human being. And the two things that I know that human beings do, just kind of naturally, like we breathe, is we love and we work. So if you put a human being behind bars and you are leveraging the 13th Amendment to extract labor from them at a cheap price, what we are doing is diminishing their humanity. Not only are we doing that by putting them in a cage without a real mind towards reform, which, to your point around quicker sensibilities, was, I think, the intentional purpose of the prison, right? We're now locking them in cages, making them work in some cases, or them choosing to work and then paying them. What I heard recently was here in Philly, Wilfredo, we were doing 88 cents, but that was a median average. Apparently, folks were as low as 20, closer down to what you were getting paid. And so this is, it should be shocking to everyone that hears it. It is a sin and a shame. And so I think it's important for municipal governments to be asking those questions. How are we actively, and I guess I don't even call it unconsciously, but we're putting in the back of our minds how we are literally exploiting human beings for their work, something that they would do naturally, but that they should be rewarded for. If you're going to use their labor, even if they are incarcerated, particularly, I should say one more thing, particularly with folks who are in pretrial detention. This was something else that really threw me off, was that folks that had not even been gone to trial yet, that might be being held, are making this wage, which I think is a sin and a shame. And then there are those who do that, try to save up their wages to pay bail. So we start getting real complicated in terms of how wild this gets. But anyways, I think my point is that I think the municipal government should take this very seriously about the way that we're treating human beings that are in the care of the state. And that's what it should be. That even if they are incarcerated, these are human beings to care for, and we should honor them with the dignity that they deserve and the labor they put forward. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for putting that kind of like teeing up that piece, because this is going to be like kind of the speed round. And I am actually weaving in questions as we go into this last round. I love that King quote about the arc of the moral universe is bent towards justice. And then the next beat on that speech is because you have to pull it. And that's my words, not his exactly, but that's the genesis. Like somebody has to pull that arc towards justice. It doesn't just naturally go towards justice. So on that kind of thought, we're going to mix up the order here a little bit. Jennifer, I'd like you to talk to us a little bit about where you're seeing, people pulling that arc towards justice and bringing cases or, bringing reform movements across the country, and how are you seeing that play out?
Yeah, I mean, there's organizing around the country by formerly incarcerated workers. We have a work stoppage in Alabama as we speak in a prison near Birmingham. This is a state that during the midterm elections in November, voters across party lines voted to amend the state constitution to effectively end slavery and forced labor without exception. That was one of 4 states where voters did the same. There's been a movement towards ending these exclusion clauses in state constitutions. There's recently a hearing in the New Hampshire legislature to potentially bring a ballot initiative to voters in November. Similarly there, as well as some other states where advocates have been pushing for these reforms. We're seeing lawsuits in Colorado, in Alabama, 2 states, as I mentioned, Alabama, prior to Alabama, Colorado voters amended their state constitution to end slavery and voluntary servitude and forced labor without exception, to cut the exclusion clause from their state constitution. And in both states, we've seen incarcerated workers file class action lawsuits challenging forced labor in those states. In Colorado, the case is farther along. This is a class action of incarcerated workers who were forced to work in the early days of COVID, who were punished with denial of visitation, being put in more restrictive housing units, an effective extension of their time that they would have to serve in prison because they were fearful of contracting COVID or had COVID and didn't want to report to work in prison kitchens. There's also pending lawsuit in Louisiana, also a class action lawsuit filed in September, brought on the class of incarcerated workers who are forced to work in the agricultural farm lines, challenging both the forced labor, saying that this is a violation of the 8th Amendment, prohibition on cruel and inhuman punishment, but also proposing 2 subclasses of workers. If all of the workers were forced to work in agricultural work at Angola prison in Louisiana State Penitentiary, who are paid at most 2 cents an hour, most of whom aren't paid at all. Pretty much all workers at Angola have to start doing agricultural work in incredibly degrading, horrible treatment and conditions, very hot conditions, doing hoe work, even though the state has better agricultural equipment. It's like deliberately degrading treatment of workers. And they brought their subclasses are people with disabilities who are forced to work despite the incredible potential damage to them, as well as they also brought a challenge on behalf of all people who've been convicted by non-unanimous juries, because the 13th Amendment contains this language that says that only those who are duly convicted can be forced to labor. And in Louisiana is one of the states that allows non-unanimous juries to convict people who've been accused of a crime. And so their argument there is that this is a violation of the 13th Amendment. But beyond that, we have the federal legislature and state legislatures also considering workers' rights. Senator Booker has introduced a suite of 5 bills that are really strong that would end some of these legal exclusions, that exclude incarcerated workers from the Fair Labor Standards Act, that excludes workers from minimum wage protections and overtime protections, that ends the Title VII exclusions from protection from discrimination in the workplace, the OSHA exclusions, that the federal workplace and safety law that currently barely applies to very, very few workers. It means that there's very little federal oversight of safety conditions, which is similarly mirrored in state laws and state practices, which means that incarcerated workers suffer incredibly hideous injuries, including deaths on the job because of the lack of those protections. There's a lack of training for these workers, lack of protective equipment, and we documented in our research really horrific injuries suffered by incarcerated workers because of these exclusions. The federal bills also include ending forced labor by ending some of these punishments in federal prisons and as well as ending the requirement to work in federal prisons, and making work voluntary. And the idea is truly voluntary, as well as increasing vocational training programs, which have been declining. What we're seeing is that more than 80% of workers are doing maintenance work to maintain the very prisons that confine them, but there are very few jobs that actually provide true vocational training and job skills that can translate into paid work and fulfilling work after people return home to their communities. And so there's a real movement, and we've seen some states. Wilfredo has been active in New York, where there are 2 bills pending in the state legislature, and we've seen some efforts in other states as well to increase wages. Although at the same time, we also see these wages have been stagnant for decades. Most incarcerated workers haven't seen in each of their states a raise in decades. And we've been talking about the pennies per hour that workers are paid. I just have to mention that up to 80% of those wages are deducted. They're deducted by prison systems to cover room and board or costs of confinement, as well as other criminal legal system fines and fees. So incarcerated workers are seeing very little money, and in 7 states are not paid at all for their work. In the South and largely former slave states.
Thank you so much. It's really this, again, multi-system approach to looking at this issue and all these different layers. I want to ping over to Alex for a second around that kind of 2-part question of like, where is the legal jurisdiction to make change? And then Wilfredo, I'm going to you next about what is the change that would be moved to be able to move the needle first. But Alex, let's start. One of our participants asked about the 8th Amendment, and Jennifer talked about that a little bit. Leading into the 8th Amendment, is there power in the 8th Amendment around making some changes? Is there power in the Congress has the enforcement clause of the 13th Amendment? And you did also give us that Easter egg a little earlier about the good law of the 1866 Act. So can you talk a little bit about where there might be opportunities or where not?
Good news. I think that unfortunately, I have to be pessimistic about that. The 13th Amendment comes after the 8th Amendment, and therefore the 8th Amendment, cruel and unusual punishment, presumably, which, certainly I would echo that. I see why this would be cruel and unusual punishment, but the 13th Amendment language would not, that argument would not be a winning one in court because of the 13th Amendment language. Really, the mistake, in my opinion, the lack of foresight in the way that those who adopted this language, how it would affect people in the long term, or now well over, what is it? 160 years after its ratification, was not thought through. Again, we don't have the record as to why that was. Probably it was to be accommodating and defined language from the 18th century, from the Northwest Ordinance, that everybody found to be amenable. It made it easier to find consensus. The Republicans needed some Democrats. Democrats at that time were supporting Southern readmission without any end of slavery, and they were trying to find a few different radical Republicans in particular, Charles Sumner, Thaddeus Stevens, James Wilson, and others were trying to find some mutually agreeable language, and they found this language that created a very harmful effect. But the only true change that could come of this would be through a new amendment that would remove this language from the 13th Amendment. Congress could pass such a statute that would prohibit the use of slave labor in prison, in federal prisons, but because criminal law has traditionally been within a state police providence, I cannot imagine that any statute that Congress might pass symbolically would withstand judicial scrutiny.
That's very, very interesting point in the policing powers of the state to be able to be in charge and define that.
Of
Thank you
criminal
for
law,
that.
criminal law, yeah, state power.
And the majority, if I'm correct, the majority of people incarcerated are in state prisons as well.
That's
So this would
precisely
be,
right.
yeah,
The
so
vast
thank
majority
you.
of crimes are under state law, not under federal law.
Mhm.
Yeah, so Wilfredo, when you think about kind of the pieces that would start to move the needle in some state level action, and also Alfred in the Q&A also wanted to understand, if not minimum wage, what kind of thoughts do you have around an appropriate and fair rate of pay? What are you thinking around that? And then also safe work conditions. I've heard you speak on these two areas in the past. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the work that you're doing in New York around this.
Okay, so right now the two bills that Jennifer alluded to were sponsored by the 13th Forward. They were a group, it's an organization started with Legal Aid Society, Citizens Action of New York, and a whole bunch of different, even SUNY and CUNY schools have jumped on a board and have kind of held the provost's feet to the fire when it comes to minimizing his use or, having his hands tied that he has to actually use Coldcraft as an approved vendor. So I just always throw out a number because I feel like for me, someone that's been system impacted and directly impacted for 20 years, that $7 an hour in a 35-hour work week is about roughly $220. $220 right now will be an enormous stimulus package for the over 30,000 people that are housed in the Department of Corrections in New York. But the first thing you have to do is close the loophole. You have to do what the profunctionatory other states have done, like Alabama. And I think Mr. O'Rourke would agree. Let's just close that up, because you know what that does? These elected government officials that want to be reelected to these particular positions, they don't want to be on the other side of slavery. They don't want someone else using a campaign saying or a tactic that all of a sudden this particular senator such and such did not want to close this loophole, so he is for slavery. So what that would do is that will bring everybody around, that will bring people to the table, and that will bring money allotted to go ahead and say, let's have a whole bunch of people go ahead and talk about how we're going to fix it or how we're going to raise wages. Well, the thing is, you need to bring the people that were directly impacted and system impacted to the table to talk about what those wages are, because you have to prevent the state from trying to have other fees or other administrative fees or costs or possibly charging for medical insurance inside in order to get some of those wages back. So the thing is that that's the system of checks and balances that needs to be in place, because until that one loophole is closed, and then it can bring everybody to the table to say, look at us, we already closed it up. We're real progressive. It's not going to change. But even that $7, I never want to say I would want to have minimum wage. I think it will be an outcry from the public to say, here are people directly impacted that have committed crimes against society, and you're going to provide them the same minimum wage. I hold myself accountable for any crimes that I've committed, and I work tirelessly within my community to make sure that I am now the cure and not the epidemic. So the thing is that when you have people that are credible messengers, and I know that term is a cliche that's utilized all over urban areas, but you have to have that social character currency to be able to sit in rooms and have tough conversations with government officials, with correctional officers, to be able to say, look, we have nothing personal against you, it's the system. So there are a lot of upstate prisons in New York that have dealt with a lot of generational wealth at the hands of the blood, sweat, and tears of the Black and brown. So I think if you bring everybody to the table, we close this loophole, and we're able to find a round number that can be accepted by government, not corrections, because corrections finds a way to pay $2,000 for a copy machine, $700 for a ream of paper. So somehow all of a sudden they need to trim that fat and be able to say, now, let's take this money. Let's go ahead, and even if you mandated that some of it has to be put on the side to be saved, to be utilized for their reentry process, I'm sure the men would have no issue with that, because at the end of the day, successful reentry or reintegration back into society is ultimately true public safety. If you don't get the men and women ready to prepare to go home and be productive in society, they'll become jaded, they'll become bitter, and what they'll want to do is they'll want to come out and commit more crime. And the data, like I said earlier, is clear. The majority of people will return back. but in the way they're able to come back and the amount of brokenness that they have to deal with, a lot of even mental health issues that they have to deal with, of being in the carceral state for so long and trying to not integrate into a place that they may be potentially 10, 15, 25 years removed. It's a process, and it's an arduous process. But government has to be hand in hand with community to be able to say, look, we've already dealt with this carceral state. Let's leave this dirty word of reparations out the way. Let's go ahead and hold SUNY and CUNY accountable as far as those reparations to bring higher education and make it available in all institutions all over the state, so that way everyone can work on their own habilitative process. Because you can't say rehabilitation. If you're adding the re, that means there was some form of opportunity already there. Most of us have already been failed by a lot of government institutions before then. So if you're able to now work on our habilitative process cohesively and hand in hand with government, then all of a sudden you'll find out eventually that's true abolition. It will lower crime, it will lower the statistics, and it will lower the numbers. Abolition is not to eradicate immediately, because then what? So I feel sometimes when you have that radical point, there has to be some form of medium where government understands that everyone is logically coming to the table to have these uncomfortable conversations and be able to say, this is what we need to work towards.
That was unbelievably powerful. Thank you so much. That really, the nature of an understanding of ensuring that people are at the table that have not only the experience, but also the will and understanding of the people, and how the government and the people have to work together is the key to what our democracy is based on, what our society is based on. It's we the people, and that means all of us, in that we, not just a few of us. And how do we build this together? Because the people are sovereign. Councilman O'Rourke, it's perfect ending for you, because you are that connective tissue between all the different constituents and all the different people. And when we think about, what is that role of government? To engage and interact with the community, to not only hear and speak for the community, but also to understand what the community needs to know, be aware of, and educated on, so they can make change. So can you kind of help us see where that action is, where that societal action is between our local government, our state government, even our national government, and how we can connect those dots and give citizens also a call to action to make choices in what they should and shouldn't do, and what policies they should talk to their council people about?
I think what you're asking is part of a larger question about American attitudes towards democracy, right? We live in a republic, which is rule of law, and we've expressed that through majority rule. And that requires, in order for it to work, it necessitates engagement. And that is essentially, what, as an organizer prior to this work, I understand to be the ability to get anything done is through relationships, right, which come on the heels of engagement, as the building blocks of power. And so, I think the call is to every single person in every level of government, federal, state, as well as local, and every citizen that is paying taxes into this system, to engage on a regular process. I say, and this is a bit general, but just to make the point, oftentimes I'm talking, especially right now in the midst of a campaign year, about the importance of voting. The last thing that we do in a functioning democracy is vote. That's the final thing that we do in the process. There are a number of opportunities by which we can and for which we should engage, that before you even go to the ballot box in the spring or in the fall. And some of that looks like engaging with is not only voting in every single election. It's, if you have some ideas, it's you actually running for office yourself if you think that those things should be espoused. It's making sure that you don't skip jury duty when you actually get the piece coming in there, so you can help shape how those rulings go. But also, there's this model that a lot of elected officials, now I'm part of that list with a whopping 3 months in, that I lift up as well. My whole train of thought just disappeared from me because somebody's walked past.
But you're doing great, so don't worry.
It's gone. I don't even know what I was about to say.
So you were talking about like the voting and the policies and the action of the citizen to not only vote.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very, very much. Co-governance. That's the term that's being utilized now. Is that as elected officials, and this should be a given for most folks, but there should be intentional relationships between the councilmanic office, the mayoral office, the legislative office, as well as the community group that's working on the thing. It's one thing to go and cast your ballot for whichever candidates have been tried out in front of you, but what does it look like for us to be a part of the brainstorming process that turns out to be a legislative proposal that you can now give to the relationship that you have to the legislator that can now make that a bill, right? As we know, organized money is kind of what wins out in this country, but that's not the only thing. The organized ballot does it, and the organized body. Can we pull people together and recognize the power of a collective voice? We have seen over the course of about the past 15 years, I would say at this point, the national attitude towards prisons, incarceration in general shift drastically because of people building groups around or organizing around decarceration, reading groups that read Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow. For some time, this would have been back in 2015 when 13th came out on Netflix. I was hosting a series of viewings where we all sat down and we watched it and we discussed it afterwards to educate us on that. These things are immensely helpful in getting folks to see the connective tissue that will ultimately bring about that will ultimately be realized as more liberation, more freedom, and I guess a more just, I dare say, more just system that we have there. And it really is just a call to engagement. Do not forsake your opportunity, and I would dare say your responsibility to engage with the system so that we can shape it. It's not perfect. It isn't perfect, but we can tinker with it. We can adjust it. And again, the moral arc is long, but to your point, it bends towards justice when we pull it. So pull.
Yeah, and I think this is unbelievably a fascinating topic. I could keep you all here for like 4 more hours. And I know all of our audience and some of our California students have to jump off to go to a different class, but that's the point. The point is, where can we bend? And to Alex's point, where it's not actually easy to bend that area, that is not a legitimate pathway to take. Because I think it is really important when we talk about these issues and we say, it's your responsibility to the public, to the community, to ourselves to take action. We also have to understand what levers you can pull and what are really difficult and not going to be effective to pull. I love the idea of a 28th Amendment, but also understand how difficult that might possibly be. So that might not be the easiest, quickest, or best route to take at first. But this collective group and this understanding has moved the needle for me and our viewers so much. I just want to kind of capture some of the big ideas we should walk away with that all of you have said. Alex, you really teed us up with this idea of understanding our history, gives us an ability to understand our present and a way to effectively change our future. So thank you for making sure we do not forget to really dig down deep into why it was written, how it was written. And sometimes we don't have all the answers on that, but still unpacking it is good to know. I think, Wilfredo, you gave us like 30. I could pull through this around the way, but people who have social character and currency should be at the table. Councilman O'Rourke, that goes so nicely with your talking about engagement and that idea of co-governance. We need to make sure we're inviting people to be at that table, to have a voice, and who understand what those policy choices are and how they're personally affected by it, because they have been themselves affected by it. And the true public safety, and Wilfredo, you answered my question, is what is the purpose of prisons? What is the purpose of true public safety, and what is the end goal to have engaged and healthy citizens and a just society? Thank you all so much. Jennifer, I'm not going to end without talking about kind of your eye-opening thing, which was really this point that you said earlier when you were talking about Louisiana and you were talking about the Angola prison. People, we need to open our eyes to these places, these sites of incarceration in our country. We need to visit them and we need to look at them directly and stare at that bright light that is hard to see, that is hard to hear, and say, is this right? Is this what we believe in as a just society? I think it was Eleanor Roosevelt that says, Are we not looking at all of the people in every area, in every way, to make sure that we're holding up a just society for everyone, no matter where we are? That's what makes us a healthy and productive democracy. Thank you all so much. I feel like I'm just going to put in the lens that I will be asking you back for part 2. But thank you all so much. Have a wonderful night. Thank you for enlightening us all, and have a great
Thank you
night,
so much.
everyone.
It's an honor to meet the rest of you as well, Wilfredo, Nicolas, and Jennifer. Thanks so much, Carrie.
Thank you.
Thank
So
you.
much.
Thank you, Mr. O'Rourke. Thank you for everything.
Likewise,
you so
brothers.
much.
Take it easy, my sisters. Be well. Bye-bye.
Yeah.
All right.